Now the Chinese activist Chen Guangcheng has reached New York. Beijing and Washington are hoping to put what could have been a tense diplomatic situation behind them. But can they? And on what basis should the US judge China's human rights record? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. Chinese activist and dissident Chen Guangcheng and his immediate family arrived in the United States on Saturday, capping off 3 weeks of rollercoaster diplomacy that reached the highest levels of the Chinese government and the White House. Mohammed Shokir has more.
He's the Chinese dissident behind the diplomatic rift between the US and China. And after a month of wrangling over the fate of Chen Guangcheng, he and his family finally arrived in the US on Saturday. But while this may be a small victory, the fight is far from over.
We should link our arms to continue for our fight for goodness in the world and against injustice. So I think that all people should take up this responsibility and work towards the common good worldwide.
In a country often criticized for its human rights, Chen's case stood out. He's one of China's best-known activists. Though blind from a young age, he taught himself the law, and in the early 90s fought his first battle against the authorities. He traveled to Beijing to appeal against taxes that were being wrongly levied on his family, and he won. But he is perhaps best known for advocating the rights of Chinese women forced into abortions and sterilizations, a brutal misapplication, he said, of China's one-child policy. He was thrown in jail on charges of disturbing traffic and destroying property. Later, he found himself under house arrest, where he and his wife were allegedly beaten by Chinese authorities. Eventually, he managed to escape to the US Embassy in Beijing, where he sought help to leave China. It's unlikely he will ever be allowed to go to China again. And while his arrival in the US marks the end of the diplomatic row, Chen says his battle to highlight injustice in his own country is far from over. Mohammed Shokir for Inside Story.
So just how representative is Chen's human rights struggle of the Chinese? And can the United States' definition of human rights be universally applicable? Well, to help us answer these questions, we're joined by our guests in Hong Kong, Simon Chen, Associate Professor of International Relations at the Hong Kong Institute of Education and the Chinese University of Hong Kong. In Washington, D.C., David Finklestein, Vice President and Director of China Studies at the Center for Naval Analyses. And on the line from Beijing, we have Mei Renyi, Professor of International Relations at Beijing Foreign Studies Universities. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for joining us. Let me begin with our guest in Beijing, Professor Mei. A lot of attention obviously given to this case involving Chen Guangcheng. Just how representative is he of Chinese human rights activists? How well known is he? How big a phenomenon is he within China itself?
Well, I think this. I've just heard. The news report about that through your PA. Through the telephone line. I think that this is the kind of report that is going over and over again in the media of foreign reports. I would say that this case is not the kind of thing that would impress a lot of Chinese in my country. The thing is, one thing is, it is a pretty local thing. It is not a national thing. I would say this now family planning is an important part of a policy in China if China wants to keep its population down so that the population will not eat up all the development results.
We will get to the specifics of what he fights for, but let me first perhaps turn to David Finkelstein in Washington. You just heard Professor Mei in Beijing saying his case is more local than anything else, that Chen isn't actually very well known at the national level. He says he will continue, though, to fight injustices, presumably in what concerns him the most, which is allegations of major enforcement measures undertaken at the local authorities within some of China's big populous provinces like Shandong to enforce the government's one-child policy, or as the Chinese would call it, family planning policy. Do you think that being abroad, particularly in the United States, his voice will be as heard as it might otherwise be if he were within China itself working alongside other activists?
Well, that's hard to say at this point. We don't know what Mr. Chen is going to do while he's at NYU, whether he's going to focus on his studies or speak out. We just don't know. But I think Professor Mei said a couple of important things that I would agree with, but for very different reasons. First, I probably would suspect that Mr. Chen's case is not well known in China because these types of things don't get a lot of coverage in the media. But he's also quite correct in saying that this is a local phenomenon, and I think that most people who follow these issues would argue that it's local issues that are becoming more and more problematic for the leadership in Beijing.
Simon Shen, in Hong Kong, how would you regard the role that Chen has played this far in promoting his struggle for what he says is human rights within the country? Do you think that by leaving, going to a country like the United States, Chinese human rights dissidents and activists might have lost an influential voice?
Well, there are both sides of the story. On one hand, many mainland Chinese citizens, they don't like the ideas to rely on a foreign country to improve its own human rights. But on the other hand, it's one of the only means that they can rely on. So at least here in Hong Kong, we have a lot of coverage of this particular case, even though I also suspect in mainland China it's not that well known. If you buy into the idea that you have to rely on someone else to improve your own human rights, then they would welcome this case. On the other hand, if you are sticking with the nationalistic tone, then probably you won't be too impressed. So it depends on your own perspective.
Professor Mei, Chen has praised the Chinese government for what he says was its restraint, its conciliatory approach in handling his case, allowing him to leave for the United States. Why did Beijing adopt this approach? Was it in a way caving into US pressure, or was it simply trying to rid itself of what could have become a festering problem if he'd stayed within the country?
Well, I would say that this is maybe a diplomatic compromise on both sides. He was in the American embassy for a few days, and both sides did not want to actually to have this case affect the dialogue that was going to happen, the strategic dialogue between the two sides. So there must be a way of moving away this case from this kind of a dialogue, important dialogue between the two sides. So I think this is a way of doing it, to getting it out of the way so that the dialogue, more important things between the two countries could go ahead.
But does his departure also give the Chinese authorities less incentive to investigate the allegations he's made of wrongdoing against local authorities?
I think that what he protested against might be true. I'm not sure about the thing, but this kind of things could have happened in China, in some of the rural areas, because of various reasons. So if you take up an individual case, this sort of things might have happened. So there is a reason for him to put forward this idea there.
And what you are alluding to is the issue of forced sterilization and abortions and other harsh measures that were allegedly carried out by local authorities in many of the rural areas within China in order to enforce the government's one-child policy. Mr. Finkelstein, do you believe that the Chinese authorities actually mishandled Chen's case, that somehow China might have been justified in maintaining a firm grip on population growth, considering the many pitfalls that a country with this kind of huge population, 1.3 billion people, might engender if there was too rapid a change that came about?
Well, there are certainly some people who argue that the idea of keeping population under control is probably a good thing for China. But where the arguments occur is in the means, the ways and means of carrying it out. And so that's where the rub is, how these things are carried out and whether they're carried out in accordance with laws, national laws, how local officials carry these things out. So the problem is in how these things are actually implemented.
Professor Simon Chen, if I can turn to you and just put to you this survey by the Pew Research Center in 2008 finding that 76% of the Chinese population actually supports the government's one-child policy. Do many Chinese people you encounter in Hong Kong, elsewhere, believe that the government was justified in implementing this policy, however mishandled it might have been at the local authorities, that it was a way to alleviate the growing political, socioeconomic, environmental burdens that a country as big and with as huge a population as China might have faced?
Well, I think there are two issues here. One is the one-child policy itself, whether it is something that we should support. The other thing is that the measures for the Chinese government to implement the policy and how this policy is being formulated. I think more concern in my hometown, Hong Kong, is the fact that sometimes the policy is not implemented by strictly legal means, so that there are different dissidents protesting against the policy. So even though the policy is supported by many people in China, sometimes there are still lots of controversies due to the fact that it's not implemented or formulated in a strictly speaking legal way. So to some extent, this is exactly the reasons why these kind of dissidents are gaining widespread support from outside China. But also we have to pay attention to the fact that sometimes the local government in China are hijacking the central government in terms of bullying some of the local dissidents. Sometimes the national government, they don't have their ideas. So when it comes to the national level, they are also having a lot of disillusions. They are not expecting to handle these kind of cases until the local governments tell them that they have made the initial judgment. So they have to do the cover-up, and it seems to be the same case here.
And it's interesting that a way to escape the strict rules of the one-child policy, many expectant Chinese mothers travel overseas to give birth to a second child, mostly in Hong Kong, which is exempt from the one-child policy. And according to the Committee of the One-Child Policy, 35.9% of China's population is currently subject to the one-child restrictions. So there are lots of exemptions. But many Chinese people, meantime, argue that their understanding of human rights is different to the West's, a result of China's unique history and socio-political system. Chinese Confucianism places a greater emphasis on harmony between the individual and society, as well as the individual's responsibilities within a society. As a result, greater importance is given to the rights of the community or the collective rather than to the individual. That's in comparison, of course, to the West, where individual rights and personal freedoms are paramount. But the difference in understanding also extends to what human rights actually mean. The Western notion focuses on civil and political rights, whereas the Chinese tend to emphasize economic, social, and cultural rights as being the most important. Professor Mei, should China be evaluated, as often happens, through the matrix of Western liberalized democracies, most of which, it has to be said, have a population that is much smaller than Beijing, which today stands at 20 million?
I think two things. One is China, when it started to take off as a rather backward country and with a lot of people still in poverty, the stress on economic and social development would be the priority, and that is an important part of it, of China's human rights approach. And I think that is correct, because when you are hungry, when you don't have a proper housing and so on, you are talking about other things without this material basis that is a little bit, beyond the expectation of the ordinary people. But the other thing is we are not actually ignoring political rights or political freedom. I think, in discussing these things in mainland China, that the important thing is we need to have a historical perspective. That is, it's developing. It might, some people may say that we are not developing fast enough, but we are moving forward. Well, if you compare the current situation in China politically with, say, things 10 or 20 years ago, you'll see the difference. You'll see the progress. So I think we need to have a sort of long-term perspective in looking at, and historical perspective in looking at the progress China has made in this respect. This is my understanding of the thing.
Dr. Finkelstein, can anyone deny that China has indeed made huge progress over the last 4 decades, opening up economically, socially, dealing with the burdens that this huge population growth has put on its shoulders? Does China's unique population growth then explain the kinds of measures the state has had to take in order to alleviate those kinds of burden and in order to better provide, frankly, for its population at the education, at the health levels, at other levels as well?
Yeah, well, thanks. And of course, Professor Mei makes a lot of good points. Another demographic reality, let me just throw this out because nobody has mentioned it, is that China's population challenges are not just size of population, but the mix of the population. We now have entered the age of the 4-2-1 Chinese family, with 4 Chinese grandparents being supported by their son and daughter who has only 1 grandchild. And so we have a situation in China where China is in fact going to get older before it gets richer. And so it's caught between a Malthusian crunch. On the one hand, the Chinese population has to be kept in check to a certain degree. And of course, how they do that is the essence of the human rights issue. But on the other hand, if they don't have enough young people coming into the workforce, then how are they going to support the aging population? So this is one of the incredible dilemmas that Chinese state planners are going to have to grapple with. On some of the other points that were made, some of the excellent points that were made, 15, 20 years ago, Chinese friends could make with a certain amount of legitimacy the claim that the first objective of human rights is to feed and clothe a population. And indeed, the Chinese government and the party state have made tremendous progress in achieving that. On the other hand, you now have pockets of China that are in fact developed, and in fact developed as any other parts of the West or any other parts of the developed world. So the problem with China is that there are multiple Chinas that exist simultaneously. You have a China of haves that are developed. You have a China of have-nots that still need basic human needs. The problem is, how do you come up with a human rights policy that accounts for all the diversity? But I think it's getting more and more difficult to sell the argument that because China is merely a developing country, the first issue of human rights is feeding and clothing people.
Multi-ethnic society,
but it's not universally true.
A multi-ethnic society with its challenges, but also, as you say, still a developing society, despite the major economic advances of the last few decades. You mentioned human rights, you mentioned it more than once. Is the United States in a position, though, to lecture any country, China in this case, on its human rights record? Many people would consider it farcical that the US, whose agents kidnap people from all over the world, render them, quote unquote, take them to unknown secret locations or Guantanamo Bay, where they have no access to counsel, no trials for very many years, no charges against them, that a country like this can actually berate China on what it ought to do on human rights.
And that's a terrific and honest point. So let me just address that for a moment. Number one, the United States should not be in a position to lecture China or any other country about human rights, but the United States feels a responsibility to advocate for universal human rights. And I see a difference between the two. One is wagging your finger and lecturing and pointing out the failures of a country, which there are plenty of failures to go around. But advocating, I think, is a positive thing, because this is a society here in the U.S. where people do believe that human rights is a universal aspiration. And of course, the United States has made all sorts of problems. There are all sorts of transgressions that have occurred, not just recently, but throughout our history. But the major and significant difference is that the American people are allowed to have a free and open debate about that we have a system where course corrections can be made, where excesses and transgressions of our own laws can't remain hidden forever, and action is possible to correct that. And that's what I think is so vibrant about the American system.
Professor
Yes,
Mei,
we make our mistakes.
Let me just interrupt you here and put the question to Professor Mei, if I can, in Beijing. First of all, what do you make of what you just heard Dr. Finkelstein say, that the United States merely advocates, doesn't do much more, doesn't begin to lecture, but advocates on human rights? Do you think the U.S. is in a position to do this and to judge based on one yardstick?
Well, I would say that is no country in the world should play the role of a judge or a lecturer lecturing on the human rights of other countries. Well, the United States, when it was first founded, it was supposed to be a city on the hill. That is to say, by demonstrating its example for others to see. Now, that is certainly permissible. That is to say, I just have a report, on my desk that is just a day ago, the United States House of Representatives voted against an amendment of the Military Authorization Act on indefinite detention of people by the military far away from, as suspects of terrorism, far away from the battlefield. And that is one thing. If this is part of a law, and if this happens in some other countries, I think there might be people in the United States saying that it's terribly inhuman, it's violating human rights. Yet, that was what happened. The House voted for this. So I would say that we can see that there are problems with each country in human rights. So not pointing finger at another country, but we can discuss, we can talk about these things. That will be the right approach towards human rights issue.
Professor Shen, looking at it from your vantage point, from your position there in Hong Kong, is the Chinese government, in your view, justified in proceeding cautiously when it comes to human rights, to political reform and liberalization, considering the pitfalls that we spoke about, in giving primacy, in essence, to the collective well-being of an entire society rather than the individual?
Well, Hong Kong is part of China, of course, and sometimes we do have different opinions regarding the definitions of human rights. But I think the point is that sometimes we have to have some compromise or consensus. In recent years, in our academic community, there is a new idea or new concept called the China model that is having a lot of attention from the other parts of the world. One of the debates within the China model is that whether there is such thing called universalism, where human rights have one single universal definition. Some of my main colleagues think it doesn't. Some of them think it does. So I think your answer depends on your definitions on universalism. If you think human rights have only one standard, then we'll have one set of solutions. If you think each country has its own standard, then you will come up with another set of solutions.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all of our guests in Hong Kong, Simon Shen, in Washington, D.C., David Finkelstein, and on the line from Beijing, Renyi Mei. And thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. You can, of course, send us your feedback by emailing your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Rida Fakhri. Thanks for watching.